Chapter 3. Anti-occultism as a new form of Nazism.
I don't make the claim lightly that the enemy is reviving Nazism in a new form, nor do I casually compare the methods of the Nazis and anti-cultists. The fact is that for your enemy, Nazism is a very close concept. The Third Reich is where modern anti-cult fighters find their roots. To understand the entire chain of events, it is essential to know that Hitler in particular, and Nazism in general, heavily relied on the Protestant Church and the anti-cult movements of that time.
Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, was known for his radical views. He actively fought against other Christian denominations and religious movements, demanding the death penalty for citizens who understood faith in Christ differently than he did. Moreover, Martin Luther was a fervent anti-Semite. He declared that Jews were a misfortune for the German people, advocated burning their synagogues and schools in the name of the Lord and Christianity, and stated that if he were to baptize a Jew, he would lead him to a bridge, tie a stone around his neck, and push him into the water. These radical views of Martin Luther, which became the foundation of Protestantism, later played a role in the growth and spread of Nazism. Hitler admired Luther and called him the greatest German genius, and Protestant ministers, in turn, began to support Hitler's ideas. German Protestant pastors infected with anti-cultism on the territory of Germany are largely responsible for the spread of Nazism among the German believers. The rise and development of Hitler's ideology was based, among other things, on the Protestant and Catholic religions. Later, atheists were even banned from joining the SS. Thus, a supporter of Hitler was typically a devout Protestant or Catholic. By 1932, Hitler's party, the NSDAP, received 60% of the vote among Protestant pastors. Support ranged from 90 to 100% in small Protestant communities, especially in Bavaria. Historians assert that the Third Reich began in Bavaria as early as 1932. As early as in 1921, in the Protestant Church, the Apologetic Center was established, a prototype of modern anti-cult organizations. Officially, the Apologetic Center was supposed to monitor the activities of other religious movements and inform the Protestant church community about them. In reality, the Apologetic Center began collecting data on various cults, movements, circles, and other associations. In 1932, Pastor Walter Kunneth, an anti-Semite from Bavaria and the chief editor of the Protestant publication Word and Deed, became the head of the Apologetic Center. This marked the beginning of a campaign against non-Christian movements, such as anthroposophy, Darwinism, Maoism, spiritualism, and occultism. Movements that the Protestant Church viewed as competition. Lectures and articles were produced on this topic, with many ideas and methods inheriting an inquisitorial approach. On April 26, 1933, Walter Kunneth presented a report titled "The Church and the Jewish Question" to the Federal Church Administration in Berlin. In it, he called for the swift eradication of Judaism, which he described as a foreign entity within the body of Germany. This report had a profound influence on the final adoption of anti-Semitic policies. On December 16, 1933, the Gestapo noticed and appreciated the work and methods of the Apologetic Center. Thus, Walter Kunneth united with Adolf Hitler in the mission to eliminate Jewish influence on the life of the people. At the same time, Kunneth sought to permanently rid society of other religious and political minorities. Kunneth was really pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work. This is what he wrote in his report to the leadership of the Reich's Protestant Church. The Gestapo has expressed great interest in the cult archives of the Apologetic Center, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against illegal free thought alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. the exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun.
From this point on, the staff of the Apologetic Center began intensively supplying the Imperial Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials about the political positions of various religious communities. The Apologetic Center also collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This work focused on developing materials to combat Jews and cults. Lists of the so-called cults and sects, that is, any groups the Apologetic Center deemed dangerous to state ideology, were maintained and constantly expanded. As a result, representatives of the Apologetic Center, led by Walter Künnert, produced numerous slanderous pseudo-expert reports. This defamation turned these groups, along with the Jews, into targets for the Nazi dictatorship and subsequent brutal persecutions, including the deportation of their members to concentration camps.
Historian Horst Junginger writes, if in 1931 they counted about 150 religious and non-religious ideological communities for which data were collected, and 2 years later about 250, then by 1936 the archival lists recorded about 500 groups and cults considered dangerous. It is also important to note that violent methods that were later demonstrated by the Gestapo both before and during World War II were borrowed from anti-cult organizations, particularly the Apologetic Center organized by the radical part of the Protestant Church. Prototypes of the anti-cult movement have existed since remote antiquity. Persecution and execution of Jesus Christ, establishment of the Inquisition, all of this, and much more, was practiced by the ancient predecessors of modern anti-cultists. Throughout the centuries, they adapted to external circumstances and changed the form, but always maintaining their essence. Their weapon was, and still is, genocide in its various forms. Thus, the radical views of the Apologetic Center were formed long before the radical views of Adolf Hitler himself. Researchers note that Hitler followed Luther's instructions against the Jews precisely. Historians also emphasize that the pre-existing anti-Semitism on the part of the Church determined the character of the German national movements. In other words, it determined Nazism itself. It means that the radical vector against Jews and dissenters was determined long before the Gestapo emerged. It is interesting that in 1933, immediately after its foundation, the Gestapo began to adopt the experience and exchange documentation, precisely with the anti-cult Apologetic Center. Protestant pastors, who held radical views, constantly urged the Gestapo itself to further tighten its methods of combating Jews and dissent. For example, in 1942, the Bavarian evangelical Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Auer, even demanded from the Nazi government another St. Bartholomew's Night, during which no Jew would be spared. It is also interesting that after the war, these pastors were not prosecuted for their Nazi proclamations. Surprisingly, after the war, Walter Künnert was not convicted for his anti-Semitic views and collaboration with the Gestapo, unlike many other Nazis. On the contrary, Künnert received the Maximilian Order for Science and Art and the Bavarian Order of Merit from the Free State of Bavaria. Starting in 1946, Walter Künnert became a professor of Protestant theology at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. Künnert was awarded the honorary title of Church Counselor.
Now you know that it was the anti-cultists who were responsible for making Nazism so violent. They made Nazism such as the world knows it nowadays. Moreover, it was with the hands of the anti-cultists of the past that Nazism was revived after World War II. After the victory over Nazism, the international community united to create the United Nations to maintain and strengthen international peace and security, ensuring that humanity would never again experience the horrors of something like Nazism. At that moment, many believed that Nazism was gone forever. However, in 1964, the Protestant Church of Germany officially reinstated the position of Commissioner for Sects and Ideological Questions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria, appointing Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack to the role. He became the successor to Kuhnert's Nazi legacy and the leading ideologue of anti-cultism in Europe.
In his studies of sects and cults in Bavaria, Hack referred to the Sektenerhebung, study of sects, conducted by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria in 1930. Here's an interesting fact. Hack studied Protestant theology in Bavaria at the University of Nuremberg, during the same years that Kuhnert was a professor of Protestant theology there. At Hack's initiative, the name Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues from the Nazi regime was revived in the early 1970s. He adopted an almost identical name from the Nazi era, the Department for Religious and Ideological Issues.
All this happened at a time when the world and Germany were trying to live a new, free life, respecting everyone's rights. The flames of Nazism that had engulfed Germany had been extinguished, leaving behind smoldering embers that would have eventually died out on their own, leaving Nazism in the past forever, if not for Hack. He thoroughly rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He rejected what countries, even those that had been enemies, had united for. He rejected the core values accepted by the entire world, values of unity and equality. In his works, Hack declared, "If we understand our faith correctly, we have no right to allow the others to continue in their faith." It was on Hack's initiative that lectures and sermons about sectarians and cultists began again in Bavaria, where Nazi ideas had always been powerful. Hack provided instructions that Protestants or Catholics should treat sectarians as subhuman. This reignited the flames of Nazism, and in 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich, cries were heard once again in Bavaria towards dissenters. Hang them, shoot them all, Heil Hitler. In 1990, the anti-cultist Hack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements, the so-called sects or cults. Only 16 years later did the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rule that defamation was being used in the fight against these groups. But it was too late, as in those 16 years, the efforts of anti-cultists had already rekindled and spread the flames of Nazism further. Anti-cultists of the past were the forerunners of modern anti-cultists. Anti-cultists never broke the direct line of transmitting their knowledge and methods. Thus, modern anti-cult organizations were established using the model of the Nazi Apologetic Center.
Thus, after World War II, Wilhelm Hack helped his brother in faith, fellow anti-cult activist Johannes Aagaard, establish the Dialogue Center International in Denmark in 1973. Although the center's name suggested peaceful dialogue, it was merely a facade. In reality, Aagaard, like Kuhnert in the Apologetic Center, was a Christian anti-cultist who sought to combat so-called totalitarian sects. Aagaard publicly mocked the First Amendment to the US Constitution, a symbol of a free society, calling it a neurosis and claiming it was unnatural to human nature. The Dialogue Center had branches in Greece, England, India, Ireland, Russia, and Germany, where Hack served as vice president.
And who do you think became one of Aagaard's favorite students? The student whom Aagaard would repeatedly defend in courts. You have already heard a lot about him today, but now you will understand where he got all his methods. The Dialogue Center's representative in Russia was Alexander Dvorkin, Hack's pupil and Aagaard's favorite student. While in exile, Dvorkin closely collaborated with Hack, Aagaard, their follower Pastor Gandau, and other European and American anti-cultists.
Thus, Dworkin directly and wholeheartedly adopted the Nazi methods, modeling his work on centers aimed at combating all dissenting groups of people. Orthodox Christianity in Russia is now repeating the history of Protestantism in Nazi Germany. During the Nazi era, anti-cultism was introduced into Protestantism through the radical views of Martin Luther, and now, in the same way, Russian anti-cultism, led by Ratzirs, has infiltrated orthodoxy and is poisoning it from within. History is repeating itself. The Irenaeus of Lyon Center, created by Dworkin in 1993, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, completely mirrors the Nazi apologetic center established by Kunith. This center claims its mission is religious research. Yet, in reality, it acts as a tool of harmful informational propaganda against new religious movements, ideological associations, and even business structures.
Does your center in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon currently monitor those networking activities?
Well, of course, we do our best whenever possible. Also, we need to take another stratum into account, that there is a huge number of non-religious cults. I mean all sorts of personal development trainings.
Commercial ones, so to speak.
Commercial ones as well. They are different. Commercial ones include multi-level marketing organizations, for instance, Amway or Herbalife as the most famous one. Although, again, there are very, very many of them. In fact, those are psycho-cults, I mean pseudo-psychological cults. In other words, all kinds of trainings of personal growth, of increasing inner awareness, how to discover femininity or masculinity in oneself, how to win the hearts of the opposite sex, and many, many various types.
Dworkin introduces the term totalitarian sect, and like Kunith, conducts lectures and writes articles on the dangers of sects and cults and the rejection of cultists by followers of the dominant religion. Similarly to Kunith and Hawk, Dworkin compiles lists of totalitarian sects that, in his opinion, threaten religion and the state. In his addresses and lectures, Dworkin even uses the same rhetoric as the Nazis of the past. For example, Hawk categorically rejected the Declaration of Human Rights as unnecessary. Dworkin stated that today's weakness in Europe is a direct consequence of replacing its Christian soul with so-called universal values, which, in reality, mean nothing. Do you remember how Kunith said that Judaism represented a foreign cell in Germany's body that needed to be eliminated? Dworkin claims that
cults bring no benefit to society. We don't know cultists who are writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on. They only drain society of its vital resources. Just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
Another method that modern anti-cult groups have incorporated from Nazism into contemporary practice is the creation of blacklists of organizations and groups which they have labeled as sects or cults and which, in their opinion, should be eradicated. They regularly update these lists with new religious movements, making them targets for attacks. Naturally, this is presented as a necessary measure to ensure society's safety in the face of potential threats. Yet, let's go back to the Nazi times so as to draw one more parallel.
When the NSDAP seized power in Germany, and anti-cultists joined forces with them to fight against religious movements that supposedly posed a threat to the nation, the situation for religious minorities began to deteriorate significantly. In 1938, the Guidelines to Combating Sects was published, leading to extremely dire consequences for many dissenters. According to the guidelines, the danger of sects and cults manifested in the following: educating followers to have egocentric views and indifference towards all matters concerning the people and the state, refusal to take oaths and give the German salute, rejection of compulsory military service, rejection of taking on positions in state and movement organizations, refusal to participate in workplace assemblies and to work in the armaments industry, rejection of the National Socialist racial theory. Similarly, Dworkin, on the portal he created, the Information and Consultation Center of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, posted a list of organizations he labeled as destructive cults and totalitarian sects. Each criticized organization has a page featuring a list of negative publications about it from various media sources, which were apparently initiated by the center itself. The style of these publications about different organizations is very similar. They are filled with identical emotional and judgmental headlines and descriptions, and extensively use emotionally charged language, in essence, hate speech. This includes deliberate defamation and the portrayal of members of the criticized groups with dehumanizing labels such as zombies, rapists, slaves, beasts, and other dehumanizing epithets. By means of similar rhetoric, in their time, Nazis dehumanized Jews. Now you see the lists compiled by the Nazis on one side, and, for comparison, the list compiled by the leader of the Russian terrorist anti-cult group, Alexander Dvorkin, on the other. As you can clearly see, the anti-cultist list encompasses virtually all religious minorities in the Russian Federation, including even some representatives of Orthodoxy, whose views differ from the main line of the country's official religion. Additionally, the list includes some business enterprises and secular organizations. Similar lists can be found on the websites of other anti-cult organizations. And among those lists, you can also find a large number of secular organizations in addition to religious ones. These include various medical, sports, social, research, and scientific organizations. In total, millions of people have already been labeled by the anti-cultists. This demonstrates the unimaginable scale of the campaign of harassment against innocent people that the anti-cult movement has launched worldwide.
The primary objective of the lists of the so-called sects is to precisely identify to society, law enforcement, and authorities the so-called dangerous antisocial elements that must be fought against, even to the point of complete eradication. We can see the consequences of creating such lists in the rise of Nazism in Germany.
It is known that a directive signed by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of internal security in Nazi Germany, established the procedure for suppressing certain religious societies and sects, as well as arresting and sending all associated individuals to concentration camps. Among other things, it contains the following lines. Immediate measures will be taken against organizations, clubs, unions, and circles, as well as against leaders and individual people. All organizations, clubs, unions, circles, etc., all without exception will be purged. Existing materials, specifically address lists, card indexes, correspondence, equipment, occult items, writing supplies, and any property will be confiscated. They will be dissolved and banned. Simultaneous searches will be conducted in the homes of leading members of circles, as well as those suspected of possessing such materials. Persons dedicated to secret teachings and sciences are subject to arrest in all cases. Their activities will be banned without exception, under threat of the harshest measures from the state police. In each individual case, they must be sent to a concentration camp. This operation must be carried out throughout the entire Reich, if possible, between 7 and 9 a.m.
Just as anti-cultists did in Nazi Germany, Dvorkin and his network of anti-cult groups provide authorities with materials about representatives of the so-called cults and sects. Dvorkin's center issues defamatory expert opinions on the nature of various groups, prompting authorities to investigate and prosecute them. This slander against innocent people in Russia, just as in the Third Reich, already results in brutal persecution and physical reprisals against citizens. The ideas promoted by Dvorkin reflect the same Nazi stance expressed by Hack, Kunert, and Hitler, hatred of dissent, intolerance, rejection of pacifism, and justification of violence. And this is just one example of many anti-cultists, but it is enough to see their direct connection to Nazism. These are direct proofs that Nazism never disappeared. It has merely changed its form and adapted to new external circumstances. Yet, we can observe a direct line of transmission of knowledge, experience, and methods for combating dissenting groups of people with the aim of their complete eradication. Representatives of global anti-cultism use all Nazi methodologies, but for their purposes, they have expanded and refined them. Thus, the flame of Nazism has intensified. Now you see evidence proving that global anti-cultism is a formidable force that has already gained significant power and is striving towards its goal, the complete destruction of democratic values and the establishment of a new Fourth Reich.
Chapter 4: Anti-Cultism Crimes Against Humanity.
The path where citizens' freedoms are trampled upon amidst their own approving cheers leads only to one end. It seems that you have started to forget about this, and those who do not remember their past are doomed to relive it. Therefore, I will remind you of the final destination of this path. Humanity now treads, and the depth of the abyss into which anti-cultists and the hidden shadow force behind them are pushing it. One person once said, with frightening prescience, that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. And shortly thereafter, all of humanity witnessed firsthand the embodiment of this prediction. Or rather, just logical reasoning in the horrors brought by Nazism. The citizens of Germany barely had time to react before the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe group into the country's leading political force, bringing with it terror, war, and genocide. Today, Nazism is remembered as the embodiment of extreme hatred, intolerance, discrimination, and totalitarianism, everything that is inhumane and anti-human. So now you know that Nazism in its most atrocious form was instigated by the anti-cultists of that time. All those methods used by the Nazis were typical of the anti-cultists from the most ancient times, and they rely on them even now. During the rise of Nazism, the anti-cultists instilled in Hitler and his henchmen the belief that only through fear could they conquer the world and win people's love, that it was the fastest and most effective way to gain total power, and so it happened. One of the main methods the Nazis resorted to at that time was genocide of individual dissenting groups and of entire nations. And if you closely examine the history of humanity, it becomes clear that genocide has always been a tool to strengthen the power of those who stand at the root of the modern form of anti-cultism. Now, let's recall where it all started during the Nazi era and draw a parallel to how the anti-cultists operate now. Nazis, at the instigation of their anti-cultist advisors, acted in a planned and systematic manner, preparing public opinion through propaganda, or rather through the manipulation of mass consciousness, convincing the German population to the necessity of war and genocide. Now, I will provide clear examples of what the present-day anti-cult movement already represents at its core, and what it could degenerate into if it remains unexposed.
Genocide.
The sequence of actions and the destructive focus of anti-cult organizations clearly indicate that they ultimately lead to the same outcomes as those brought about by Nazism. Right now, in front of the global community, the international terrorist network of anti-cultists is preparing the world for a new genocide. As a result of their actions, millions of people have already been labeled as members of cults, putting them in the position of potential victims. Those of you who have studied what genocide is understand that it is a process that unfolds over time. It does not happen in a day. Society is systematically and gradually prepared for genocide. This process has rather specific stages that can be described and, most importantly, recognized when they are being put into action.
Genocide refers to any actions committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Common risk factors include societal instability, increasing intolerance, systematic human rights violations, lack of state protection for the population, and the presence of motives and incentives in the information field that justify the use of force against specific population groups. The first stage of planned genocide is the dehumanization mentioned above.
The process and all its stages can be vividly observed in the example of the Holocaust. After the Nazis came to power, they began the first stage, propaganda that Jews were not human and that they posed a threat to society. Caricatures and articles demonizing Jews started to emerge. The myth of a global Jewish conspiracy was actively promoted. Gradually, people, the German population, became convinced that Jews were indeed a threat to them and their children. Similarly, anti-cultists are currently targeting various religious groups, branding future victims as cultists through informational terrorism. This tactic implants the notion in society that a cultist is equivalent to less than human. Now, I want to draw your attention to another fact. Propaganda, like terrorism, works in two directions simultaneously. One direction is the planned activity aimed at the potential target, and the other is the actions directed at everyone else, the general public, that is, at the witnesses of the crime being committed. Because to carry out such an operation, as the Nazis did at that time, and as the anti-cultists are doing now, the approval of the society is required. If not active support, then at least silent agreement and non-resistance. And for this, they first need to convince people that those the anti-cultists have chosen as their targets are dangerous to society and pose a potential threat. The public is first intimidated, their vigilance is lulled, and then, by deception, they are drawn to the anti-cultist side, making them accomplices to the crime. Back then, during the Holocaust, the German people became accomplices in the genocide of the Jewish people. Now, the accomplices to the crimes of anti-cultism are the people of Russia and those countries where anti-cultists are freely allowed to operate, where they still feel a sense of impunity and unchecked power. Just as the Nazis once marked Jews with a yellow star, anti-cultists now brand dissenters with the label cultist, which, in their interpretation, designates the target that can and should be destroyed. And take note, those who marked Jews with yellow stars may not have personally killed anyone, but in doing so, they incited violence among others. This is precisely what anti-cultists are doing now, opening a hunt on individuals and organizations they deem undesirable. Through covert manipulations, they incite all others to commit acts of violence while remaining on the sidelines themselves. This first stage of potential genocide became possible as soon as the anti-cult movement emerged, branding ordinary people simply for what they believe in. As soon as the labels cultist and totalitarian sect appeared, this stage has already been reached in modern society.
The second stage of a planned genocide is discrimination. This is when a branded individual or group is stripped of their human status as full membership of society, effectively ousting them from the social sphere. In Nazi Germany, Jews were initially prohibited from holding certain positions. They were banned from working as doctors, serving in the military or police, and teaching in higher education institutions.
There were too many Jewish doctors, too many Jewish lawyers, too many Jewish businessmen, too many Jewish journalists, too many Jewish bankers. The Nazis then could play upon this broader sense that the Jews had overstepped, the Jews had become inordinately influential.
Gradually, they were excluded from all professions. After the so-called Nuremberg race laws were enacted in 1935, Jews were further restricted in their freedom of movement. From then on, they could only live in designated areas, the ghettos. Today, people are already facing religious discrimination in countries where the anti-cultists have significant influence. For instance, leading European Union countries, Germany and France, have faced criticism for reviving practices that can be seen as religious purges. For example, Germany has implemented a practice known as the cult filter. This procedure requires individuals seeking employment or conducting business with government institutions and companies to confirm that they are not members of the Scientology Church and do not apply methods developed by Ron Hubbard. Suppose the answer is yes, and the person does affiliate with the Church of Scientology or has attended their lectures in the last 3 years. In that case, they will never be hired by a government agency or even a private company or association that has contracts with a government agency. Such measures apply to a wide range of professions, such as tennis coaches, gardeners, IT experts, instructors, trash bag suppliers, web designers, translators, etc. Legal practice in Germany already has dozens of court decisions that have deemed such cult filters illegal, including some issued by the highest federal courts. These rulings cite the violation of Scientology's rights to equality and non-discrimination, referring to Article 4 of the German Constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion. However, sanctions and penalties resulting from these court decisions seem to have no effect on some federal states, such as Bavaria, where the practice of cult filters continues to be applied today, despite judicial prohibitions. Thus, it can be asserted that the second stage of genocide, the stage of discrimination, is already being implemented in several countries right now, where groups of people labeled by anti-cultists face social isolation, job dismissals, prohibition to freely express their views, forceful persecution, and imprisonment.
It is clear that to prevent genocide, we must eradicate discrimination and prejudice in all forms and combat the spread of hatred and hostility based on ethnic, religious, and other distinguishing characteristics. However, the most tragic aspect of this stage of discrimination against an unjustly branded religious organization is the reaction of the witnesses to such actions. At this stage, it is no longer just silent agreement. In many cases, such events are met with approval. By this point, the preliminary psychological conditioning of the masses has convinced them that these cultists deserve their fate, viewing them almost like carriers of a contagion that could infect others. The fear of being associated with cults, the fear of public condemnation, shame, and the fear of being isolated from society, just like the victims, compels people to approve of the discrimination against innocent individuals. Therefore, with each new wave of escalating tension around the targeted organization and each new information attack, fewer people remain who can objectively assess the situation and contribute to preventing genocide. Similarly, once the German population was convinced that if the authorities treated Jews in a certain way, it meant they deserved it. What was the reaction of the German people to the new discriminatory laws? People openly supported them, and public support for Hitler significantly increased. Similar laws are now being implemented in Russia, modern Germany, France, and other countries regarding representatives of religious minorities, whom anti-cultists have labeled as followers of totalitarian sects. These people are subjected to persecution, raids, forcibly coerced to abandon their beliefs, deprived of their freedom, and placed in labor camps. Notice that this kind of discrimination against individuals labeled as cultists in your modern society is already perceived as something quite logical and even natural. Mostly, these people are left to fend for themselves, and only these religious movements targeted by anti-cultists take care of protecting their interests. However, their efforts, all attempts to defend themselves against lawlessness and deliberate persecution, are not supported by other people, that is, society. The image of a cult prevails in people's minds over simple human qualities, conscience, and empathy for others' suffering. If you see something like this in your mind, know this: you are a potential victim of genocide. I remind you of the expression that accurately reflects the situation you are currently in. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Remember, first, you become a silent accomplice to the crime, and then you become its victim. As you know from history, Nazism did not stop at the stage of discrimination.
The third stage of planned genocide is persecution.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
In German society of those years, a growing sentiment was imposed that the measures taken were insufficient, that the threat from Jews still existed, and that the problem had not been resolved. Transitioning to this stage witnessed a surge in instances where Germans themselves began to assail Jews, dispensing vigilante justice. Pogroms erupted in ghettos, with Germans shattering the windows of establishments owned by Jews, spitting in their faces, and pelting them with stones. And mind you, Nazi propaganda didn't rely on facts and logic. Its aim was to evoke maximum emotion, to intimidate, to instill a perpetual sense of alarm, and to direct people toward an enemy upon whom they had every right to vent their fury, to release the pent-up tension.
The Nazi propaganda machine managed to convince the German people so effectively that Jews posed a threat to their personal well-being and the well-being of the country. As a whole, that Germans themselves began to appeal to the government to take action to rid them of the fear of the threat supposedly posed by Jews. Ultimately, the Nazis resorted to open persecution. Jews were shipped to Auschwitz and several other concentration camps. Well, as for what happened in those camps, you already know all too well. An entire people were systematically exterminated, innocent individuals, even children, for absolutely no reason. And just as unjustly, millions of dissenters are now under threat, because until the final stage, the climax of events, there remains just one step. And when that step will be taken, it's a matter of time. The entire process from the rise of Nazism, from the first acts of discrimination against Jews, to the first mass execution in a concentration camp, did not take much time. Today, the anti-cult movement, as a branch of global anti-cultism, has been around since 1993, roughly 30 years. And the peak of its manifestation is a matter of, perhaps, 5 years, maybe a year, or even a single day. And I'm not exaggerating. It all depends on the bridges they have already built, the behind-the-scenes political maneuvers they have conducted, and the tactical and strategic steps they have taken to close this trap. Right now, anyone labeled by anti-cultists as a cultist is a potential target, just like the Jews who were once herded into gas chambers to suffocate or had their skin stripped off alive to preserve its elasticity for the gloves for some high-ranking official. Do you think such things can't happen in our time? You simply don't know what anti-cultists are already doing today.